Good afternoon, and welcome to the Every Student Succeeds Act webinar. We have just a few reminders today. The slides will advance automatically throughout the presentation. Should you need technical assistance, click on the Help button. You are encouraged to submit a question at any time during today's presentation by typing in the Ask a Question tab and clicking Submit. In order to stay within our time, we will not be able to answer all questions individually, but all questions will be reviewed to provide future guidance. If your screen freezes or the slides do not appear to be advancing as they should, please try exiting and restarting the session, as it may be an issue with your connectivity. I will now turn the call over to Kevin Draper, Assistant Director in the Office of Educator Effectiveness at the Ohio Department of Education. Please go ahead, Kevin.
Well, hello everybody, and welcome to our webinar today. This is the fourth in a series of webinars the department is hosting to engage with you regarding Ohio's ESSA plan. Today we are discussing the topic of highly qualified teachers. Before we begin and show you where we're looking to go, it's important to know where we came from. So I want to take you a little bit through the history of HQT in Ohio. HQT really kind of came to the forefront of our discussion, first authorized by the No Child Left Behind Act in 2001. That was a reauthorization of the 1965 Elementary and Secondary Education Act. As a result of that, ORC legislation was enacted with 3319.074, which touched on professional qualifications of teachers. This piece of legislation outlined the core academic content areas and subsequent requirements to be HQT. We now currently have our Every Student Succeeds Act, or ESSA, which was authorized in 2015. This is the most recent iteration of ESSA and is our most current federal legislation. Since federal laws were removed in some situations, Ohio law remains intact until it has currently been changed. So we are still abiding by our ORC 3319.074. Going back to the No Child Left Behind Act of 2001, states were asked to put a highly qualified teacher in every public school classroom by 2005. In order to do so, Ohio was required to work on defining those highly qualified teacher requirements. Ohio's highly qualified teacher requirements can be found in three specific components. Again, these are coming from ORC 3319.074. The first is the educator must have a bachelor's degree. Second, they must have a valid Ohio license appropriate to the teaching assignment. And thirdly, they must have evidence of content knowledge in core academic subjects of that teaching assignment. If any part of that is missing, the teacher cannot be HQT. It's important to note that HQT applies to individuals who are providing instruction in core academic subjects. And we will go over what those core academic subjects are in just a little while. Those who are providing instruction to students in core academic subjects need to be HQT. They do not necessarily have to be a teacher of record. This would include groups like our tutors or intervention specialists. As we look at the current list, we see what ORC has defined as our core academic subjects, including English, reading, language arts, math, science, foreign languages, civics and government, economics, fine arts, history, and geography. Again, that's outlined in that ORC code that you can find if you'd like to reference that for your future help. During the No Child Left Behind Act, prior to the passage of ESSA, there were a variety of Ohio state HQT responsibilities. They were largely threefold and include the extent to which all students have highly qualified teachers, particularly with a notice on minority and disadvantaged students. The state was to adopt goals and plans to ensure that all teachers were highly qualified and then publicly report that information and progress as they move through those years. The information above that we're talking about, reporting, is available on local report cards. It's gathered in the EMIS system and can impact Title I funding, and that's reviewed by our Office of Federal Programs. The Department of Education has provided an HQT Toolkit, which hopefully you have had an opportunity to reference. Since its inception, the most recent iteration was put out, and we'll talk about that in a little bit later, so that stakeholders within the state and district and individuals can understand the responsibilities they have with regard to HQT. So how did this all impact the state as we started to focus on highly qualified teachers? The graph that you're looking at shows a substantial increase from 2005 and 2006 to 2013 and 2016 that raised from 94.4% to 98.7% in 2013 and 2014. That can be focused on a variety of different factors, including legislation, increased field response from those who are working at the local LEA level, and also our teacher preparation programs taking this issue on and helping to prepare those coming into the field so that they have the certain requirements as they go in to be hired. So as we move forward and we look to what ESSA is now requiring, it's important to note a variety of different things. First off, Ohio will continue to require highly qualified teachers in core subjects in the 2016-2017 transition year. Now, with the December 10th, 2015 passage of the Every Student Succeeds Act, or ESSA, states are no longer federally required to ensure all teachers of core subjects are highly qualified. However, Ohio will continue to require highly qualified teachers in core academic subjects in the 2016-17 transition. This is dictated by current state legislation, report card requirements, and the state equity plan. ESSA does require the state educational agency will ensure that all teachers and paraprofessionals working in a program supported with funds under this part meet applicable state certification and licensure requirements, including any requirements for certification obtained through alternative routes. So as we talk about our transition, 2016 and 2017 has been identified by US DOE as a transition year. The transition year is an opportunity for an orderly move from the requirements of NCLB to those that are in ESSA. During the transition year, ODE will work to redefine qualified educators as well as make decisions regarding maintaining or altering the existing list of core academic subjects. So again, because HQT is found within a variety of Ohio legislation and impacts data collection and reporting, Ohio statute remains in effect until it has been amended. We will continue to look at these different options as we move through the transition year. This should provide some comfort to the field for our 2016-2017 year, as it is very much a business as usual. As we look at that transition plan, there are a couple of opportunities that you can explore what NCLB's transition to ESSA looks like. The U.S. Department of Ed has put out an FAQ document outlining all of the changes on February 26, 2016, and a simple Google search will provide you with that information, which can give you some additional background and consideration. Now, we hope that the information regarding HQT remaining is not something that is coming as a surprise to you and those in the field. We have put out a variety of HQT communications to date through a variety of different opportunities. One of those has been Ed Connection updates. Two of those went out, one in June, one in July. We've also put out 2 CCIP notes. Those have gone out in May and June. So we have tried to get this information out in a variety of different capacities, and hopefully those discussions have been had. This does have an impact on something called the equity plan, which we will be discussing in a future webinar. So during this transition year of 2016 and 2017, the state requirements stay relatively the same. We will still measure and report the extent to which all students have access to highly qualified teachers, and HQT teachers must remain in core academic subjects as dictated by that state legislation, report card requirements, and our state equity plan. Some of the key points to note about this 16-17 plan for local districts themselves are that districts will continue to report numbers of HQT teachers in EMIS. That reporting is ongoing, and that information has not changed. Educators providing instruction in core academic subjects must be HQT, and districts will begin to develop local equity plans to address equitable access to excellent educators. That is another component of the equity plan, and that seminar will be happening next week to give you some additional information. If you're interested in finding some of that information, just search on the education.ohio.gov website for equity plans, and that should populate very quickly. By September 30th, districts are to be completing and uploading their local equity plans, and I hope that you are already engaged in that work. As always, we try to update and provide information with our HQT Toolkit to help districts during the transition year. This year, we have made the forms fillable. So previously, they were something that you had to print out before you could just fill them in by hand, but now you can do that online, makes things a little bit more neat. They can be saved and printed with that individual's information. If you go to education.ohio.gov, search the keyword HQT Toolkit, that will populate. It has a variety of information about annual reporting instructions for school leadership. We've updated our frequently asked questions to also talk about this transition to ESSA. So hopefully you will download that resource and review it as needed. One component we just want to quickly touch upon is how title funds and ESSA are going to work. It's important to remember that ESSA may no longer include highly qualified teachers, but it does have requirements for teachers and paraprofessionals working in a program supporting with title funds. ESSA states, the state educational agency will ensure that all teachers and paraprofessionals working in a program supporting with funds, so those are title funds, under this part meet the applicable state certification and licensure requirements, including any requirement for recertification obtained through alternative routes to certification. Future information about funding and ESSA is forthcoming from US DOE, and if you have additional questions, you can certainly reach out to our Office of Federal Programs. At this time, as we continue to think about our core academic subject content areas, ESSA has amended the term core academic subject areas to define them as a well-rounded education. That gives an opportunity to examine what we currently have in law and identify how we would like to react to that law. So if you'll take a moment, we'd love to hear some of your thoughts with regard to core academic subjects. Would your preference be to A, maintain the existing list that we showed previously, B, add to the existing list, C, decrease the existing list, or D, explore possible alternative options? I'll give you just a moment to respond. So as we continue to think about our transition year, this is one of the many questions that we will be gathering feedback in from those stakeholders in the field. And as we're roughly at about 61% of our attendees, about 40% were showing that they are interested in maintaining the list. About 30% are interested in exploring alternative options. About 21% are interested in decreasing the list, and about 8.5% interested in adding to the existing list. So we will take that information back and include it in our feedback as we continue those discussions with our stakeholder meetings. At this point, I'd like to address just two basic common questions that come up continuously with our HQT discussions from our education program specialists. The first one is, how do I know if I am indeed HQT? Teachers in schools can use the HQT Toolkit, which we've talked about earlier, forms A through E, and use that as a means to determine if a teacher is highly qualified in his or her teaching assignment. So if you follow through with those forms, it should take you through the process and help you to identify whether you are HQT or not. A second common question is whether or not HQT gets put onto a license. The answer is no. HQT status is not added to a certification or license. Schools verify and report HQT status as part of annual planning. The teachers themselves must complete the HQT forms and worksheets, and a district or school designee shall retain these records. Before we begin to get into some of our Q&A from some of the chat box questions, we are certainly going to be looking for HQT stakeholder input as we are moving through our transition year. There are a variety of ESSA outreach opportunities, including these webinars. Some will be out in the field and they are posted that we can hear your voice. Some of the specific components that we may be discussing for HQT are things like defining core academic subjects, whether or not we're going to be redefining core academic subjects. Additionally, that may impact licensure and licensure requirements for some of those individuals who are coming into the field. Finally, perhaps the most important is that we are going to have to define, as ESSA has asked us to do, what does qualified mean to the state of Ohio. So through a variety of stakeholder input and feedback, as well as our own work with legislative entities in the department, we will come together to define those issues. Now is our time to connect with the audience to answer some of your questions. And as always, due to the number of people who logged in today and the number of questions we've received, we will not be able to answer every question you've submitted. But in order to stay within our time, we'll answer as many different questions as possible. So please submit your questions using the chat function. There are reference links in the document tabs that have those available for you. Today's session is available for playback, so if you have individuals who are unable to attend or you wanted to re-listen to something that came out, please do that and share that. And for additional information, visit education.ohio.gov and search the keyword ESSA.
Kevin, thank you very much. We have a number of questions coming in, and we'll get to our first one. Are you able to provide any information based on federal guidelines what may or may not happen to the HQT requirement after this next school year?
So the HQT requirement, again, by federal law, is removed at the federal level. And so we still have HQT at the state level. So depending on what legislation does, that may change over time. But federally, we are required to have federally funded individuals have licensure, certification, and licensure requirements. So technically, that's the new requirement for HQT. It does not have the same name, but it still centers around the idea of teacher quality or teacher qualifications. So in some way, shape, or form, Ohio will have to define teacher quality.
Thank you very much. And that was Cheryl Crone, who's our education program specialist, who's joining us this afternoon to help answer questions. We had a question regarding, follow-up regarding requirements. Is a master's degree a requirement for teachers of core subjects?
It is not a requirement for teachers of core subjects. If you look at the HQT forms, in some instances it may help you provide evidence of content knowledge to determine if you're HQT, but it is not a highly qualified teacher requirement.
Thank you, Cheryl. And is there a way where our audience members may check on whether or not they are currently listed as HQT?
So if an individual wants to know if they're HQT, they would find the HQT Toolkit available on our website. And you would find the form that's appropriate for your teaching assignment, because in Ohio we actually do not put HQT status on a person's license due to the fact that your HQT status could change depending on your teaching assignment. So an individual would look at the toolkit and look at the 3 requirements and see if they hold evidence for those requirements, and they would report that to their district. That typically happens in fall. Most districts do HQT reporting through a fall window.
Cheryl, where may individuals access that toolkit?
Yep, so if you go to education.ohio.gov, in the search bar, you can type in HQT Toolkit. And once you do that, typically the PDF will pop up for you. And we also have a web page with just the individual forms available.
If they're looking at that, is there a way to, or who is the best person to contact here at the agency if they have further questions?
Yep, we typically send people, because there's a few of us that man the phones for HQT. So we ask people to go to the mailbox and send email to hqt@education.ohio.gov, and there's many of us that work to answer those questions on a daily basis and provide technical assistance.
How do these requirements impact special education teachers?
Yeah, so special education teachers are also referred to in ESSA having to hold the appropriate licensure. But again, due to state law, they also need to be HQT this year. So they are still a part of the conversation because the original No Child Left Behind Act was actually meant more for special education teachers due to the lack of content knowledge when they were going through the preparation programs and becoming teachers. So they are actually typically at the forefront of this discussion. So they will still be indeed part of it.
There's also specific information in the HQT Toolkit speaking to special education providers, so I would urge you to go to that resource as well.
And as a follow-up, will that impact intervention specialists differently who may also be teaching core subjects?
So we consider intervention specialists and special educators in the same language, so we kind of use that title interchangeably. And often we do get the question, if I'm just working in a classroom with a teacher who's already HQT, do I need to be? And that's yes. If you're providing instruction to a student, you indeed need to be HQT in that particular assignment.
Great. And how would tutors fall into that designation, Cheryl?
Yep, so when tutors are considered teachers in state law, so they in turn should be treated as similar as teachers, meaning they need to hold the HQT requirements, and often they are not reported in ESSA, so people tend to neglect that issue. But our Office of Federal Programs, we work with them very closely, and it's important to make sure you have tutor information on file, especially if the tutors are paid out of federal dollars.
We have a principal writing in from a community school who inquired whether a long-term substitute would need to be classified as highly qualified.
So highly qualified in charter and community schools does have different requirements when it comes to licensure. So in a community school, the licensure piece of HQT, you can use a long-term sublicense, but with that being said, an individual must hold the evidence of content knowledge. So no matter what licensure you hold, you still have to show, if you're teaching math, that you have evidence of content knowledge in math.
I also want to let you know to that principal that the Director Frank Stoy here is putting out an HQT document specifically focused for community schools. So I would look for that probably within the next week and a half. That should be available for you and hopefully answer some of your more questions.
In looking back at the ESSA plan and the federal guidelines, have the feds indicated any new requirements which may be presented for the 2017-2018 school year?
Not in relation to things like teacher quality. When it comes to equity, which tends to be in relation to teacher quality, we're already doing our equity plan, which again, as Kevin has said, we'll have a webinar next week on equity, which I'd encourage you to attend. And equity right now still has HQT in it. So we do have new requirements in relation to equity, but luckily Ohio's equity plan already meets those requirements. But we can provide more information on that piece in the next webinar.
That's great. Are there any notification requirements in effect regarding notification to parents whether or not a child is in a classroom with a non-HQT teacher?
So in ORC, there is language that a parent has the right to know teacher qualifications, but with ESSA, the parent notification letters that had to go home after a certain amount of time if a child had a teacher with a non-HQT teacher, that has gone away. Districts, of course, can still abide by that, But there is an ORC that districts can provide that information to parents upon request.
So it's kind of an odd component in that in the ORC, it states that parents must be notified that they can request the qualifications, not necessarily that they need to be immediately notified whether or not that teacher is HQT as soon as that child enters that classroom.
Kevin and Cheryl, what constitutes the evidence of content knowledge? Is that the passage of OAE, or is there something else that would also provide that same evidence?
Yep, so this is where the HQT forms come in handy, because depending on your assignment, the options for evidence of content knowledge differ. They differ depending on your grade level, and they also differ depending on whether or not you're a regular educator or a special educator. ORC also states the options, but the easiest place to go is the actual forms in the HQT Toolkit.
Are there any alternative paths for undergraduate teacher candidates to graduate as HQT as an intervention specialist?
So there are alternative programs that license intervention specialist teachers, and we frequently talk to them about becoming HQT as they leave programs. And this is not just an alternative licensure issue. This is also for most special educators due to the fact when they leave the programs, they don't necessarily have a content knowledge exam, which would actually test math, English language arts, etc. So many intervention specialists have to do work typically before they begin their teaching assignment. So we work with them over the summers and different things to help make sure that they're HQT.
Do you anticipate this impacting licensing at all?
There are a lot of questions that we need to work through as we go through our transition year. So I think those are some of the questions that will be brought up and discussed at the department. But as of right now, there's not a whole lot that we can go from other than what's already been put into ESSA. And we will certainly involve our stakeholders and all those individuals as we begin and continue those discussions.
Thank you very much. You mentioned that the HQT is dependent upon their current teaching assignment. Are there positions which would not be considered as HQT requirements?
Yes. So again, that's why the core academic subject list is so important, because those are the assignments with which a person must be HQT. So for example, if you're teaching physical education, that is not part of the definition of core academic subjects. You have different requirements to be a PE teacher, but HQT is not one of them. So a place I tend to direct people to when answering this question is the EMIS manual in the subject code section. It actually will tell you if a person needs to be HQT in that assignment and what core subject they would need to be HQT.
Great. As our QA box refreshes, Kevin and Cheryl, is there an email address for individuals who may have additional comments that they can address those to regarding this?
Sure. There's a variety of different emails we'd like to provide for you. First, if you're interested overall in providing content and information about ESSA, there is the education.ohio.gov/ESSA website that's available. And then ESSA@education.ohio.gov would be a kind of catch-all email address. If you're interested specifically in HQT, to reiterate what Ms. Crone had said, HQT@education.ohio.gov is a great place to go.
Great, thank you. It looks like we have time for a few more questions. Is there a timeline for newly positioned or hired intervention specialists to obtain HQT status?
So any teacher needs to be HQT upon hire. With intervention specialists, though, as long as they show evidence of content knowledge in any core academic subject, so they hold HQT in any subject, they can then teach any other core academic subjects and be non-HQT. So it basically makes them hireable because state law says all teachers should be HQT upon hire. And often they teach all core academic subjects, so getting HQT can be a bit more challenging for them. So this, in essence, just makes them hireable. They still need to meet the HQT requirements as soon as possible and would be reported as non-HQT in EMIS until the minute they are HQT, and then we always recommend that EMIS coordinators go in and make sure they've changed their status.
Great. And this will be our last question before we close this afternoon. May a teacher take an online course for HQT, and then would that go towards meeting the HQT requirement?
So it depends on the teaching assignment if a course would actually work for them. So special educators have the 90 clock hours of professional development option. So a lot of them do indeed take online courses, but it has to be in content to help them with HQT. So I would always recommend a person to go to the individual forms in the HQT Toolkit for more specific information because, again, depending on your teaching assignment, you may or may not be able to use online courses as an option.
Great. Kevin and Cheryl, thank you so much for your time this afternoon, and thanks to everyone who presented. Kevin, before we close out today, you mentioned next week's webinar. Could you give us some more information about that?
Sure. So next week we will be covering and getting a little bit more in depth with that equity discussion. In 2015, the state submitted its state equity plan. Locals, LEAs are currently working on developing their local equity plans, and that's something that needs to be submitted by September 30th. So if you'd like to learn a little bit more about what's in the state plan as well as what the requirements are going to be for your local LEAs, I would highly suggest you look at the opportunity. It's going to be a great webinar with a lot of wonderful information.
Great. Kevin and Cheryl, thank you both again for this afternoon. Thanks to everyone for joining us. This concludes our webinar.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This concludes today's call. Thank you for participating. You may now